Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador, and I'd like to talk to you about exposure compensation. Now, you'll find the exposure compensation dial on the top of the full frame mirrorless cameras, and you can use it whether you're in program, aperture priority, shutter priority. You can even use it in manual exposure mode so long as you've got ISO auto selected. Really, you can only not use it if you're in fully auto mode. You can still turn the dial, just nothing will happen. Now, one of the great advantages of having a mirrorless camera is the what you see is what you get view, the WYSIWYG. If you're looking through the finder or on the back of the monitor and the image looks too dark or too light, there might be a reason to use the exposure compensation dial. The light meters don't always get it right, and we're going to be looking at that in some detail over the coming slides. Now, on the APS-C cameras that don't have that exposure compensation dial on the top of the camera, we have that icon on the bottom of the control wheel there. If we press it in the shooting mode, we're going to be able to adjust the exposure compensation dial using that control wheel. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you're using full frame or the APS-C cameras, you're only going to see those effects of moving the exposure compensation dial if we have the setting effect switched to on in the live view display menu. This is the default, but some people occasionally want to switch this off for a variety of reasons. So just remember, if you are going to be using exposure compensation dial, setting effect switch to on. Now, one of the things that you can do with these APS-C cameras, if pressing the bottom of the control wheel and then moving the top dial is a little bit too slow, is you can actually use the My Dial settings on the latest APS-C cameras to basically switch that or toggle to using that dial as an exposure compensation dial. Now, what I've done when I'd actually implement that is I've also set then the control wheel to remove the shutter speed or the aperture if I'm using that main dial to use exposure compensation. Now, let's take a look at why we actually use this exposure compensation and why it's so important. The metering systems always want to average everything out, and maybe 90% of our scenes are average, but there's an occasional thing where it's not. For instance, this image that I photographed of a black swan, the black swan is not an average scene. So the camera will think that the dark tones are unnaturally dark and raise the exposure. So we end up with a grey swan instead of a black swan. So in order to render that black swan black, I have to lower the exposure using the exposure compensation dial. Now, you might need to do it even more if your subject is dominated by these dark tones, such as with this black gorilla, where I've had to lower the exposure compensation dial by -2 stops. Now, it might not just be your subject that is dark, it might be a very dark background, especially if that is a large dominant dark background. Again, the camera will think, oh, this is too dark, I must raise the exposure. And by raising the exposure to put detail in that dark background, we are going to overexpose our subject. So this really is why exposure compensation is so important. The opposite is true when we've got very light toned subjects or light toned backgrounds. Again, if we let the camera just use its metering system, it'll render that white wall grey and we'll underexpose by at least 1 stop. So we have to raise that exposure in order to render that white wall white. You might have seen this when people show you their snaps of their skiing holiday, for instance, where all of the images look just a little bit grey, and that's because the meter is tried to average everything out. So the snow scenes don't look bright and white, a frozen winter wonderland, they just look dirty grey because the camera has been underexposing almost every shot. Now, the goal for exposure is it doesn't really matter whether we overexpose slightly or underexpose slightly, because we can sort of fix that up in post-production to some extent, but we do need to get all of the information between the goalposts of absolute black or absolute white. If we don't, we may clip or lose information in those darkest shadows or those brightest highlights. For instance, with this very dark background, the camera wants to raise the exposure. It may raise the exposure so much that we actually clip some of the brightest highlights, and these may not be recoverable in post-production. So this really is the most important part of exposure compensation when we're dealing with these dominant dark tones, because we can lose those brightest highlights and actually lose the image completely because of it. So as we approach a scene with dominant dark tones, I almost instinctively or naturally, subconsciously lower that exposure to make the darks dark. And likewise, if I'm approaching a subject with dominant light tones, I will automatically raise the exposure to make the light tones lighter. Now, one of the metering systems that will help to some instance, which will reduce the amount that we have to use exposure compensation, is when we're using the multimeter mode. We do have the option of enabling face priority in multimeter. So if the camera picks up that there is a face there, it will try and protect those skin tones by adjusting exposure accordingly. Now this is of some help, but it doesn't prevent the camera from making those mistakes. Now, for instance, the face detect might not be triggered in this particular image, and so if the camera raises the exposure because of that dark background, we are at risk of losing those light tones on this girl's top here, and thereby losing the image entirely. So it is very important to protect those highlights using exposure compensation. I always refer to it as expose for the highlights and then process for the shadows. Now on the back of the camera you might be thinking, oh, I'm underexposing the foreground here and I don't have a graduated filter to lower the exposure of the sky in camera. But it's still best to lower the exposure to protect those highlights, because so long as we record some information in those highlights, we can then process the image for the shadows later. And the Sony sensors now are really quite good. They will allow you to raise 1-2 stops or even more to correct those underexposed shadows in post-production. Now, one of the ways we can check to see whether we are overexposing those highlights is to press the display button a couple of times until we see the live histogram. The histogram will give us some indication of whether we are overexposing those highlights or shadows somewhat, and this may lead us to making an exposure compensation. We can also press the display button when we're reviewing an image to look at the histograms after we've taken a shot. The only downside of this is the histograms are geared for the embedded JPEG preview, and if you are a RAW shooter, you've actually got a little bit more headroom in the highlights, so you could raise the exposure a little bit more than this might give you some indication that you can. Another way of protecting yourself from overexposing those highlights when using exposure compensation is the zebras function, or zebras. Now, you typically a 100 plus might just be useful for movie shooters or for JPEG shooters, but if you're a RAW shooter, you may want to watch my movie called Zebra 109 Plus, which is gearing the display, the alert for RAW shooters. So check out that movie if you're wanting to use that as your early warning system for overexposing highlights. Now, some of you might be saying right now, okay, so what happens if I just change the metering system? I've heard that spot metering is more accurate than multi, where multi tends to be the most reliable 95% of the time for most photographers. Now, if you are using a spot in this instance, for example, is where are you going to put the spot? Just putting the spot on the subject doesn't guarantee a correct exposure. You have to put a spot metering system on a tone of 18% reflectance, or zone 5. Now, if you put the spot on the black feathers of this pelican, you're going to overexpose the image. If you put the spot metering system on the white feathers, you're going to underexpose the image, and the bird doesn't have any mid-tone feathers to put that spot on. The subject is further complicated because the pelican is moving. So you're having to put a spot on a moving target. So I would recommend staying in multi in this instance and just using the exposure compensation dial. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about you can use exposure compensation in program, aperture priority, shutter priority with a fixed ISO setting, but I actually prefer to use the ISO set to auto. One example of this is I've raised the exposure because of the very bright sky background behind this racing motorcycle. Now, because of my shutter speed is already very fast, the aperture is already wide open on the lens that I'm shooting with, so raising the exposure can't increase the aperture anymore because it's already set to maximum, and it can't move the ISO if the ISO is fixed, so having ISO set to auto will just raise the ISO and allow me to compensate for this backlit subject. Another problem with maybe using a fixed say shutter speed priority with a fixed ISO is also if we're closing the aperture down to get a slower shutter speed in very bright ambient conditions, it can force the camera to select maybe f16 or f22, and that will disable phase detect autofocus, and that is something we definitely don't want to happen. So having the camera set to aperture priority and using ISO auto minimum shutter speed or manual exposure with ISO auto will help in these instances. Now I've got a movie on ISO auto minimum shutter speed because that's the workflow that I use to shoot sports. I will select my aperture when I'm using those slower shutter speeds. I might set that at the minimum the camera will allow, like f11 on an a7 III, maybe f16 on one of the newer a9 cameras. But the camera won't then select a smaller aperture because I've set that aperture, so it has to move the ISO. I have dozens of movies on my Alpha Creative Skills YouTube channel if you're really wanting to master your camera. Now I also have a website, and all of the learning resources on this website are absolutely free to download, and then you simply donate what you think they're worth. And this includes many ebooks for the Alpha cameras, one for the RX107, and also some post-production ebooks. Now if you're wanting to use me as a mentor as you learn the skills and the craft of your camera, I am available to speak to on Patreon. You can sign up for a small monthly fee, and this will include monthly seminars, Q&A chat forums, and also for the Platinum membership, one-on-one Zoom or Skype meetings. Now that concludes my presentation about exposure compensation. Just give me a thumbs up if you think this was useful, and also subscribe below so you catch every movie that I'm releasing as I release it. Okay, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador.